Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me congratulate you on your new position here and say I'm really looking forward to working with you to reinvigorate congressional oversight, which we've allowed to atrophy, quite honestly. So really want to work very cooperatively with you to do so. First chart I'm going to put up here describes and shows dramatically what bipartisan spending cooperation yields us. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, the federal government total spending was $4.4 trillion. During the pandemic, with the severe recession, trying to help Americans out of that, we went on a massive spending spree and spent $6.5 trillion that year. Now, in an American family, if let's say you spend $100,000 a year and you have a family member that gets sick and you have extraordinary expenses, maybe $50,000, you spend $150,000 that year. The following year, if you get well, you don't keep spending $150,000, and you certainly don't borrow money to do so. But the federal government, in effect, did the exact same things. For the last 5 years, we've averaged $6.5 trillion. Last year, we spent over $6.9 trillion. This is $2.1 trillion above 2019 levels. This is absurd. Mr. Vought, do you see any rationale for continuing these spending levels?
No, Senator, and thank you for the question. I mean, we're in a situation we have $36 trillion in debt. Our fiscal house continues to be a mess. When I left office, we were spending about $350 billion in interest per year, too much. And we're now in a situation where it has surpassed what we spend on defense. And we have to put forward budgets and spending plans. We have to consider them in Congress. The budget process needs to work again. And we've got to tackle this problem that you're clearly articulating.
Let's talk about how we reset spending to a reasonable level. Let me put it in my next chart. Another family analogy. Let's say that same family makes $100,000 and they have a child. So their population grows 25%. So if their income grew from $100,000 to $125,000, and let's say throw on top of that 3% inflation. So now you're at $128,750 total income. That family's kept whole, right? Kind of no harm. They've been able to maintain their spending level with increased population and inflation. Well, again, I'm trying to figure out some way to justify a lower spending level. So I've gone back in time. I went back to Bill Clinton's administration, 1998, the first year we had a surplus since 1969. Back then, Bill Clinton spent $1.7 trillion. Last year, we spent $6.9 trillion. Now, if you take Bill Clinton's spending level, again, I don't think Bill Clinton spent too little, and you inflate the spending to increase it based on population growth and inflation, with this caveat, you slot in President Biden's spending on Social Security and Medicare and interest. You leave those as they are, but you inflate it. That $1.7 trillion would be $5.5 trillion of a baseline spending. Now, if that's too reasonable for you and you want to spend more money, you could look at President Obama's 2014 spending. Back then, he spent $3.5 trillion. Now, inflate his base spending, population and inflation, using Biden's Social Security, Medicare, and interest, you'd be spending $6.2 trillion. Those would be reasonable baselines, correct? Now, I also did it in 2019. I don't particularly like the result because we'd be at $6.5 trillion. That's not good enough. Let's go to our next chart. Here's the one, and I think you've got this in front of you, that I want to use because we have a new administration, President Trump, the tail of his administration, you were probably key in producing this budget, budgeted for 2025. A spending level of $5.4 trillion. So if you take that budget, inflate all the spending except for Social Security, Medicare, and interest, that is what we spent this year anyway, or projected to spend in 2025, the baseline budget would be $6 trillion. So my question to you is, having gone through this, I realize a lot of numbers, a little bit of a rationale here. Why wouldn't this be a very reasonable baseline spending as a starting point for the next 10 years?
Senator, I think it very well could be. I mean, I think we have to get into office if confirmed and look at the numbers, begin the formal budget development for the president's fiscal year 26 budget. Haven't begun to do that. But there's a clear template in terms of the previous budgets that the president has put forward. He put forward more spending cuts and reforms and savings than any president in history. It was largely ignored by Congress. Our hope is that the budgets that he puts forward, that there's more of a take-up rate here in Congress with regard to the spending cuts that are necessary to get us out of this hole.
Would you agree right now that this is the primary metric that we need to be focusing on, is how much in total the federal government spends? It's not, I'm hearing people saying, well, in order to sign on to a budget, I've got to see $3 to $5 trillion in cuts. Measured against what? And I will just point out, by the way, is in terms of metric, you start about a $6 trillion level when we're already spending $7 trillion. That's a $1 trillion difference over 10 years. That's $10 trillion in reduced spending versus what the current Biden baseline is. I would also ask, do you think any American who voted for President Trump expected that spending levels would remain at Biden levels?
No, the president ran on the issue of fiscal accountability, dealing with our inflation situation. And to your earlier question, Senator, like any family in the country, the main metric with regard to whether your fiscal house is good or not is the extent to which you're spending and the way that drives your debt. And that's the metric, and that's the area that we'll be looking at to be able to bring it back into some rationality.
By the way, I didn't point it out on the previous chart there. I showed the Clinton level. If you inflate that to $5.5 trillion, just happens to match what President Biden is projecting for revenue. If we do this, we're that close to a balanced budget. So it's possible, and it's possible using Clinton spending priorities or even Obama spending priorities. I just soon use President Trump's. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.